Breath of the Wild, one of the most well-loved and innovative games of all time. I recently completed my highly comprehensive second playthrough of this game. I've been up and down on how I feel about this game for the past 6 years, and decided it was high time to give it another fair shake, with its sequel imminently dropping. So let's get to the heart of Breath of the Wild. Is it the pinnacle of the series, or is it more like a great tech demo? I'll also decide whether I think Breath of the Wild is what the series needed at the point in time that it came out. To answer all this, I'll share some general thoughts, followed by a look at some specific categories, which will be shown on screen. A few things to note going into the review. Number 1. Before Breath of the Wild released, I had played every other main single-player game in the series other than Zelda 2. And I would say I prefer the Ocarina of Time style of 3D Zelda over the open-air format. But this review will be a good middle ground between the ardor and distaste that I felt for this game at varying points in the past. Number 2. The most important things to me in a Zelda game have always been dungeons, story, and bosses, more or less in that order. Lastly, number 3, I ended the playthrough with all 120 shrines, over 650 Korok seeds, the main story, memories, and DLC fully completed, and all side quests completed except for a few fetch quests. Let me start with some general thoughts before I break things down into categories. I had a really good time playing Breath of the Wild again, even if it was a bit of a slow start. I would go back and forth every day playing Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring, but would almost always play Elden Ring. Something shifted in March. I think once I reached the Hebra region, where I started to play Breath of the Wild most of the days. Even if Elden Ring objectively improved on many things in Breath of the Wild, there was still that Zelda charm and wondrous world that drew me back in. I think these games played off of each other's strengths and weaknesses and were refuges from one another in different ways. I do plan to make a video essay about that dynamic one day, but might be a while. But I shouldn't understate the fact that it was a slow start for Breath of the Wild. As brilliant as the Great Plateau is, it provides particularly mediocre diminishing returns the more times you've gone through it. Something I noticed when playing Breath of the Wild is that the things I liked best in this game were the things there was the least of. The things I come back to Zelda games for are the things that endure to a greater degree. The story, the dungeons, the bosses. For me, these are the things in Zelda games that usually remain as enjoyable as the first time on repeat playthroughs. Likewise with Breath of the Wild, while I enjoyed other things too, the things I enjoyed the most were the dungeons and story. And those are the areas where there's the least content in this game. But in a sense, that's also the beauty of the game, where you can focus on just the story and dungeons, then go to the final boss. But that does leave you with a sense that you left most of the game out to wither and didn't take in what it had to offer, so there's no perfect answer. In other Zelda games, you can usually 100% the game without feeling like the story and dungeons didn't get the proportion of your time that they deserve. So that's how I'd summarize my biggest problem with this game. The things that are in shortest supply are the things that, for me, stand the test of time the most. This game relies a lot on the first playthrough joy of discovery, which is a marvelous first playthrough, a gem among the best gaming memories I have. But I've seen a lot of people that have had to face the fact that Breath of the Wild gets just a little bit less fun every time you play it, at least to many people. Also emblematic of this problem is the fact that after that final trailer for its sequel, people are talking about how we won't want to go back to Breath of the Wild. Of course, we're just speculating when we say it will make Breath of the Wild obsolete, but it still indicates something true, that Breath of the Wild didn't hit the bullseye on everything, that it was an amazing new framework and foundation, but there's a lot that can be improved and re-added from classic Zelda on top of that foundation. They say to be careful what you wish for, because it might come true. And I think this happened with Breath of the Wild. Everybody complained and complained about Skyward Sword's linearity, and then now that we got a polar opposite to Skyward Sword, people want a little bit of linearity injected back into the sequel, at least in the story. There's almost no one who isn't saying, let's add just a little bit of linearity back in. There was this huge anti-linearity bandwagon that formed after Skyward Sword, but I never understood that negative connotation. You'll hear somebody list the pros and cons of something and they'll say, this thing wasn't fun, and this character was flat, and then you hear, it's linear, which is an entirely different species of complaint because it's unclear why that's objectively bad. What got us hung up on linearity so much? Is it our societal obsession with wanting to do whatever we want? Virtually every story ever is conveyed to us in a linear fashion. In movies and books, we don't get to choose between several options at various intervals for how the story will advance. Nintendo keeps using this language of creating our own story or creating our own adventure. Some of that is great, but what's really the problem with somebody else telling us a story? The same thing we enjoy when we watch movies or read books. I think most of our favorite stories, the ones we get really attached to, are the ones that come about in a linear order that somebody else crafted and delivered for us. So I think this disdain for linearity started as a small voice that spread like a wildfire that swept up millions without them fully being aware of it. And again, we probably can say Skyward Sword's linearity wasn't perfectly executed, but linearity isn't objectively bad. It's a tool for storytelling that can be used poorly or used well. But I digress. Let me summarize my general thoughts in a few sentences. Breath of the Wild was a beautiful world to encounter once more, but what I look for in a Zelda game isn't tons of content, but a certain proportion of content, where the story and dungeons feel like they're in the forefront. Dungeons, story, and bosses are critical for me, so if one of these things isn't great, or if they take a back seat in the game's focus, that's hard for me to overlook. And lastly, linearity can be used poorly or well, and I think it would serve Tears of the Kingdom well if it would come back over to the middle ground between extremes a little and have some elements with a little more linearity to them. Now let's dive into the specific categories here. We're used to it by now, but Breath of the Wild's story is actually quite excellent. And I'm glad a Zelda exists with the memory mechanic, even if I don't want Zelda games to start telling their stories this way as the standard. Uncovering the memories and seeing the relationships Link has with all these characters in the past is a wonderful and gripping experience, especially the first time, and everything is shrouded in this enticing mystery, even though it is a shame most of these core events take place in the past. The Sheikah tribe developed ancient technology to combat Calamity Ganon 10,000 years ago, but Hyrule has since returned to a technological status more akin to the Middle Ages after these advancements were shunned. This is a fascinating story, and the juxtaposition of the ancient tech with the raw natural environments in this game is such a unique aesthetic. When Link wakes up to a devastated Hyrule, we learn that 100 years ago, prophecies were uncovered that portended Calamity Ganon's impending return. So Hyrule and its scholars sought to unearth this ancient technology to use it to battle Calamity Ganon once more. The four champions are gathered, and Zelda is tasked with awakening the sacred sealing magic that runs in the blood of the women of the royal family. And then, Calamity Ganon reawakens and turns all these preparations against them. The Hylians lose, and it's up to Link to purge the divine beasts 100 years later and save Zelda, who has been holding off Ganon for 10 decades. Zelda is very fleshed out as a character, at least compared to some of her other iterations, and it makes her relationship with Link, Urbosa, and her father especially interesting. Urbosa was friends with Zelda's mother and is a place of comfort and care for Zelda. Link's skill at his craft unconsciously becomes a towering reminder of Zelda's own failures in awakening her powers. There's also a bit of a sweet dynamic with Daruk, where you get this sense that the kind-hearted Goron has a great fondness for her. Her inability to awaken her powers doesn't really cross his mind, he just sees her as a person. The king, with the kingdom on his shoulders and the stakes so high, makes a lot of mistakes in his harshness towards his daughter, which you sympathize with, especially reading his diary in Hyrule Castle. These diary entries were also a great device for conveying additional story, the highlight being Zelda's diaries, also in the castle. So while this isn't a story framework I want to be adopted as the norm, I have no major qualms with the story itself, except perhaps that the way the story is built, there's really not much build up to getting the Master Sword, and it's missing from much of the game. So the story and memories, similarly to the dungeons, as we'll talk about later, are really solid, but just too sparse. Tying back into that wider problem that I described earlier, the problem isn't with the content, it's with the proportions of the content. As for the other characters, the champions are all good or great, with distinct personalities, designs, and abilities, and unique dynamics with Link. Their descendants range from okay to great, with Sidon and Riju being the ones that stand out. I look forward to seeing these four developed further in Tears of the Kingdom. Calamity Ganon is fairly uninteresting, but that's likely intentional, but his design, as seen at the beginning of the game, is simply magnificent. I'm talking about what's on screen here, not how he looks in the boss fights. Perhaps my favorite character other than Zelda and the champions, possibly even including them, is Cass. The concept of a Rito Bard is wonderful, and it's great how ubiquitous he is in the world, and how central he is to the DLC pack. Paya is a fun character, Beetle is always a funny addition, and King Dorephan is basically my best friend. Kilton is pretty alright, and there's some pretty charming minor characters like Robbie, the dye shop guy, Picongo, or the little bird kids. Hestu I found amusing the first playthrough and creative in design, but he was kinda a dud the second time around. Not sure why, but I found him suddenly annoying this time. I also found myself kinda hating Pura this time. I don't know why, maybe she just reminds me of a cringy and overenthusiastic anime character or something. As one last mention, the Yiga clan were also a great addition to this game's story landscape. I think one thing that's a minor problem is the sheer breadth of NPC characters that you can talk to, which makes it feel like memorable characters are more sparse than in previous Zeldas. There's some dialogue clutter because of this, and many times where, for example, stable masters will tell you the same thing multiple times. In Twilight Princess, you couldn't talk to everybody in Castletown, for example, and those that you could always added something, whether it be side quest relevant, humorous, or served as world building. At any rate, the NPCs are still mostly worth talking to in Breath of the Wild, like the Hateno village farmer telling you the legend of Zelda visiting Mount Lanayru 100 years ago, or the Zora who tells you that you and him swam together 100 years ago. The traveling merchants and adventurers, though, so there's a bit of NPC clutter, but what are you going to do, rip out those NPCs? That just makes the settlements feel unrealistically empty, so I have no great solution. There's definitely some clever and funny writing in this game, in proper Zelda fashion. For example, in the stables, there are journals where this character who will recommend pursuing certain rumors on a scale of 1 to 5, with some subtle humor in one entry where she gives a 1 out of 5 to the rumor of the sword that seals the darkness. Now, if there's one thing that has changed the most in Breath of the Wild, it may just be the gameplay. Link can now climb almost any surface, he has many armor sets, can collect a lot more materials, and cooks to heal. The bow is no longer a dungeon item, combat has opened up more weapons, and weapons break with use. Let's dive right in. There's a great gameplay dynamic between climbing to reach higher places and using the paraglider to cross horizontal distance and descend. While the climbing can admittedly get tiring after a while, I am seriously unsure if this game would have really worked without the paraglider. It is just so essential to this game's traversal and so great to use. The physics system is wonderfully crafted in this game and part of what makes this game really come to life. The new combat options are welcome and there's a lot of cool weapons, my favorites being the elemental blades and spears. Weapon durability could have been a little improved, but I do understand that this system encouraged ingenuity and experimenting. My biggest issue with the weapon system is that the Master Sword just didn't feel as special to get, not until after the Trial of the Sword, and I also don't think it needed a cooldown. I still experimented a lot with weapons, even after powering up the Master Sword and greatly boosting its durability. I do also wish there were more basic moves or hidden skills you could learn for melee weapons though. The armor system, I have a love-hate relationship because I didn't mind Link having just one iconic outfit, but there are a lot of really cool armor combinations and some funny ones. But upgrading at the fairy fountains is really a slog in execution, and armor upgrading, it kind of feels like an open world trope pasted onto Zelda, rather than a Zelda trope pasted onto the open world genre. There were also times when I wanted a way to have a status effect while staying in a different set of armor. For example, being able to somehow have the effect of the climbing armor while wearing the knight armor and hood. Collecting materials did clutter up the gameplay somewhat, but was well worth it for some of the materials that were especially fun to collect, like precious gems, silent princesses, or frogs and lizards. There was an issue as the game progressed where you had so many materials with such little use for them, but it looks like Tears of the Kingdom is solving this problem brilliantly. I also do wish that you could pick up materials while on horseback. I did cook quite infrequently. The amount of ingredients just goes up and up as you progress, and experimenting too much takes a lot of time away from the main gameplay loop. I wish there was a way to auto-cook a recipe you have already made without the 4-step process of adding all the materials to Link's arms, adding them to the pot, skipping the cutscene, and seeing the pop-up for what you cooked. The cooking also led to poor challenge scaling. The game starts out with enticing challenge and meals are decently sparse, but then challenge dwindles off as you gather more because you can heal infinitely in the pause menu by chowing down an unlimited number of meals. Previous Zelda games limited this sort of thing by having a limited bottle amount. I wish there was a limit like this, or that recovering hearts from pots or fallen enemies was still an alternative option. Or at least that you needed to be safe before you could heal, the way it is in Souls games, for example. Combat is engaging and can be approached in many ways, but enemy camps certainly still got stale, and the enemy variety is a well-deserved common complaint for this game. I appreciate that they tried to change things up with different elemental versions for various enemies, but this still paled in comparison to other enemy lineups in Zelda games. And not only is the variety not great, of the small amount that we got, several enemy types are really annoying. Octoroks are more annoying than they have ever been before, and the Yiga clan can really start to grate on you when it feels like they start spawning near you every 5 minutes with their annoying laughter. The Stal enemies also really bugged me for some reason, but I will say that Lynels make a great return and are a fun challenge, if a bit spongy and requiring you to break a lot of weapons. Honing in on the items and Sheikah runes here, they're a great toolkit. I was disappointed in my first playthrough that there weren't any additional runes that we could learn throughout the game, but I realized that's not the item philosophy that they were going for here. Magnesis allows you to manipulate metal objects, Stasis allows you to freeze objects and build up kinetic energy in them, Cryonis allows you to raise up ice pillars out of water, and bombs are, well, bombs, but this time you can choose when to detonate them. These were all great fun in puzzles and in combat, and were used in many great applications. Magnesis is a bit janky at times, but that's also part of what makes it fun. I love using it in electricity puzzles and slamming enemies with metal crates. Stasis is also used to great effect in puzzles, and it can be fun to use in combat in select circumstances, like sending explosive barrels careening towards an enemy camp. I love ice powers, but Cryonis, while used well in shrines and some Korok puzzles, was a bit of a drag for use in crossing a body of water. I almost wish there were more forms of it. You press L to activate the power, then you can press a different button for a different type of construct. Press A as usual for an ice pillar, press X to create a long path across water, press Y to summon spikes of ice from the sky for combat usage. I don't know, something like that. Bombs are of course a Zelda staple, but it's also a bit disappointing to realize that in an item gallery of only 4, one of them is kind of redundant since we also have bomb arrows already, but the fact that you can control when to detonate them was enjoyable and had some puzzle applications. Speaking of bow and arrows, it was a good call I think to make this no longer a dungeon item. It's very fun to use the various arrow types in a variety of scenarios, and I also love the bullet time effect when pulling out your bow in mid-air. We'll end off the gameplay and item section by looking at the 4 champion abilities. Mipha's Grace is useful, but definitely nothing super creative. It's basically just a free extra life. Daruk's Protection is, again, nothing too creative. When you think about it, it's just 3 times that you should have gotten hit that you get a freebie, which is useful, but it does further dampen the challenge somewhat. Rivali's Gale is wonderful and easily the one I use the most. It helps with traversal greatly, without fully trivializing climbing. Urbosa's Fury is also pretty cool. It sort of reminds me of the Quake medallion in A Link to the Past. So we'll say 2 for 4 for the champion abilities. Dungeons are one of the more contentious items in this game. Instead of having a decent handful of dungeons that take 50 to 90 minutes to complete, Breath of the Wild opted for 4 shorter divine beasts and 120 shrines throughout the world. I actually really like the divine beasts, and the pre-entrance assaults required to board them. I think the concept of the assaults on the divine beasts might be the best new thing that Breath of the Wild's dungeons brought to the table. The best of these are the ones for Vah Ruta and Vah Naboris. The divine beasts are certainly too short, and I wish there were more than 4 main dungeons, but in themselves I really like them. Being able to control parts of the beasts was a really well implemented and creative innovation. My favorite is Vah Naboris, because it feels the closest in length to a traditional dungeon, and has the most complex puzzles and design, so I actually had to think some things through, although still, none of these divine beasts are really brain busters. Vah Meadow was also pretty solid. It had a nice atmosphere in the sky and felt like it had a little bit more branching paths and a tad more complex puzzles than the other 2 that I haven't mentioned. Vah Ruta and Vah Rudania are both pretty decent and have some interesting moments and okay atmospheres. Vah Ruta's music is excellent and is the only dungeon song that I can remember off the top of my head. One thing that really baffles me is how people say Hyrule Castle is the most like a traditional dungeon, and they say it should become the new standard dungeon template in this open air formula. Don't get me wrong, Hyrule Castle was amazingly fun to explore, but it didn't really have a cohesive dungeon design, since it's a castle, and it only had a few puzzles, which I'd say is the most core feature of a Zelda dungeon. It was also entirely optional to go through before fighting the boss. I think in this sense, Divine Beasts were a little closer to a traditional dungeon than Hyrule Castle, since they had more focus on puzzles and design, and sort of had unique elemental themes. I guess I'll also mention the Yiga hideout here, which you could call a mini dungeon, and this was a great little change of pace that I had a lot of fun with. So, like the story, these dungeons were great in my mind, just notably too short and low in quantity. Now, moving on to the shrines, I also really liked the shrines, in concept. I would always rejoice when I found one, and they were one of the highlights of the playthrough. They are what really kept me exploring. The problem comes in their execution. I would audibly groan almost every time I found another test of strength shrine. They're not terrible in themselves, they're just too common compared to the puzzle shrines that I really craved. There's also the double-edged sword of the blessing shrines. Of course, it is too bad that 25% of the shrines are just one of these blessing shrines without actual puzzles. But at the same time, almost every shrine quest is top notch. And that's what comes immediately before these blessing shrines. So those are more easy to forgive. And I mean it that I really liked most of these shrine quests. I was originally going to briefly give a shout out to some favorites, but there's just so many good ones. But there's one more problem still with the execution of the shrines, with the remaining 71 puzzle shrines. A lot of them felt almost like a proof of concept, without sufficient escalation of puzzles. They would introduce a concept and then not escalate that puzzle or only escalate it very slightly. You'd reach the point where you thought, how can we take this further? And then that's exactly when the shrine would end. So, only a handful of these were particularly actually intellectually stimulating, and I wish each shrine had a little more depth to it. I think I wrote down 16 shrines that I thought really stood out. I just wish that number was a bit higher. I'd have preferred 80 shrines with more depth to the 120 that we got with varying levels of depth. I hope the sequel can improve on this somewhat. So, shrines, while having notable flaws in execution, were still what kept me going in the world once I was done with the story and dungeons, and my motivation to play the game went down basically in direct proportion to how many shrines I had left, unless I had yet to explore an area that had particularly compelling design. Out of my quote-unquote big three that I mentioned earlier, story, dungeons, and bosses, it's with the bosses that there was probably the biggest letdown. What I noticed this time around is that it's not necessarily that the boss's attacks aren't often fun to dodge, but that attacking is not as interesting. It's almost always coming down to the same stun with the bow, attack with the sword strategy, every single time. There were a couple exceptions to this idea of attacking not being interesting, so these moments stuck out like water in the desert when they did come. The best example I can think of is with Waterblight Ganon, where you have the option to use stasis to knock back his ice blocks. The problem here is that this is usually the third thing you think of. The first two things you'll think of are probably destroying the block with Cryonis or shooting the block with an arrow. So in some cases you have to work to make the fights as interesting as in previous Zelda games. All that is to say, the Blight Ganon fights aren't great. I think Fire Blight is the least interesting, with Wind Blight and Water Blight probably being the most fun overall. How much you enjoy Thunder Blight is mostly based on how much you've mastered Flurry Rush up until that point in the game. The atmospheres of these fights range from bad to okay, and the strategies are mostly the same, with occasional vaguely interesting glimmers of something more classic, like using Magnesis with Thunder Blight. They're all pretty much B or C tier, with some being better than others. I'd say the overworld bosses were overall better than the dungeon bosses, but they still wore thin pretty quickly when there were only 3 base types. With these, there's a little more you can do with strategic variation, like having elemental taluses and shooting shock arrows at the metal ankle bracelets on some Hinoxes. But that still can't keep things fresh for long when there are 40 taluses and 40 Hinoxes in the game. The best of these bosses by far is the Molduga, and I think the reason for that is because they were limited to one area and feel more novel because of that. It's also very fun to fight Moldugas while on a sand seal. It'd be awesome in Tears of the Kingdom if more regions had a unique type of overworld boss encounter that you could only find in that region, and spread out 2 or 3 of those throughout the region, like with the Molduga. Master Koga was a nice change of pace, but pretty easy and nothing special. Ending off with the final bosses here. You know, I hadn't really thought about it until now, but I really think this might be the worst collection of final bosses in any Zelda game. It's worse than the Vivati fights in Minish Cap, worse than the Majora fights, worse than Onyx and Oracle of Seasons, even the more obscure Zelda games. I can't think of anything else worse. Okay, you know what? I think the Ganon fight in the original Zelda was probably worse, but I think that's it. They're not abysmal fights, it's just the first phase pretty much just feels like more of the same, and the second phase is actually great as an interactive cinematic cutscene, not so much as a fight. The first phase sacrifices a great Calamity Ganon design from the beginning in favor of a much more cluttered and grafted thing that's basically an amalgamation of all the blights you've already fought. Again, not bad, just not as unique or special as most other final boss fights in the series. It's odd for me to say, but what I would say is probably the best boss in the game isn't even one of the bosses in the base game. I'll talk more about the DLC a bit later. The open world is what most people think of when they think of Breath of the Wild. And let me just say, while I didn't, on average, love this element as much as I enjoyed the dungeons and story, it is still something magnificent. It's so clear that time and love were put into each and every region. I really started to catch this when I was in the Hebra region, and I started to notice the unique, almost level design of each individual region with unique puzzles and quirks to each. Hebra has a couple instances of stone doors blocking the way to shrines, which require careful calculation to precisely roll snowballs to knock the doors down. Hebra also had unique puzzles for accessing shrines, like needing to travel down an icy river into a little alcove where a shrine was hidden. There was also the way in which Hebra was built for shield surfing in a way unlike any other region. Some more examples of unique level design. Eldin has a lot of mechanics involving the cannons and minecart tracks spread across it. There's also a lot of ore you can mine in the region. The Faron region is experiencing rain almost incessantly, making climbing a challenge and lightning a hazard. In the Garuda region, you can run into sandstorms where your map goes completely static and Boris will stalk you at night and shoot lightning at you if you haven't freed that divine beast yet. Gerudo also really shines when you're traversing it with sand seals, although a quick gripe on sand seals. They leave you much too quickly when you're not attached to them, and they're a bit too sparse in the further reaches of the desert if you're looking for one. Several areas also have unique and creative original wildlife, which is something I don't really hear talked about. Hebra has these furry blue rhinoceroses, Gerudo Desert has the sand seals, and Eldin has these ostriches that can survive in volcanic conditions somehow. The regions that are probably my favorites are naturally the ones that I mentioned the most above. I'd say my favorites were Hebra, Eldin, Faron, Gerudo, Akala, and basically anything that was on the coast or on the beach, which was in multiple regions. But pretty much every region was good. There's a way in which the world itself is a puzzle. In Eldin, I had totally forgotten what I was supposed to do to survive in the extreme heat. I couldn't just put a frost blade on my back the way that I could put a flame blade on my back in Hebra to survive. This is when my exploration was rewarded, when I decided to explore around the less critically hot areas of Eldin to see if I could find the answer. I eventually stumbled across a lizard and I caught it. A fireproof lizard. Aha! Other environment or weather conditions make other parts of the world a puzzle in themselves as well. So I don't have major complaints with the world except the following. Firstly, in my current state of life where I'm beginning to start a family and can't play every day, the size of the world is a bit overwhelming, and it's really easy for me to start thinking of it as a checklist. I can't help thinking sometimes, what other great games could I have played, or what other books could I have read if this world had even 20% less to explore? And of course, I don't have to explore it all, I know, but I'm a completionist, darn it, and I'm as stubborn as a Goron. And a second complaint, that I burned out after a while, and as I mentioned earlier, shrines were what kept me going towards the end. Once those were done, my motivation was mostly gone. Korok seeds were lots of fun, but they couldn't keep me going in the same way. There was, with the Korok seeds, this supremacy of what I like to call pseudo-puzzles. Placing a rock down in a circle of rocks isn't a real puzzle, nor is pulling a rock up off the ground or placing a metal sphere inside a tree stump. I get they were supposed to be simple, and there needed to be some repetition, but there still could have been a little more variety of more challenging puzzles, perhaps rewarding you with multiple seeds for ones with a greater challenge. This is why I dubbed them pseudo-puzzles. This was another problem that was wider in scope that I had with this game. A lot of puzzles weren't real puzzles, and you would often immediately know what to do. Shrines had a lot of those pseudo-puzzles as well, but to a much lesser degree, less common. I feel like this is a game that is better if you cut yourself off at a certain point, so that you don't burn out. Going in, you should decide what you want to collect and accomplish in your playthrough, but you can't let it become a checklist instead of an experience, or you burn out. I also remember playing Insomniac's Spider-Man for PS4 not too long after my first playthrough with Breath of the Wild, and being totally taken in by how fun traversal was, and wishing there were more traversal methods in Zelda that were that dynamic and high octane. Yet another improvement that it looks like Tears of the Kingdom is already implementing. So, on the whole, a wonderful world to explore that more than lives up to its reputation, but with some issues with repetition in the things you encounter, in the realms of enemy types, Korok puzzle types, and enemy camps especially. I don't think I'll be bringing on any controversy in saying that this game is absolutely gorgeous. The colors and lighting are lovely, and various biomes, weather patterns, and times of day are rendered with breathtaking detail. It would probably be embarrassing for me to count the amount of times I've hit the screenshot button during a sunset, while paragliding on a mountain peak, or even just at a random scenic location. Character designs are great, and on the whole, the art style evokes similarities to styles like those in Studio Ghibli films. The town designs are great, especially Zora's Domain, and the location designs and layouts are excellent. Most regions have at least one memorable feature. For example, the hole in the side of Hebra Mountain, or Floria Falls in Faron. The visuals combine with the music to evoke this sense of a Hyrule in ruins that has nevertheless slowly clawed itself back towards flourishing after the calamity of 100 years past, in various pockets of life throughout the world, in Hateno Village or Lurelin Village, etc. I also need to mention that the race designs are great in this game. There was a lot of creativity in this department. Some highlights for the Zoras would be Dorephan, Muzu, and Sidon. For the Rito, Cass, Kinelli, and Revali. For the Gorons, Daruk, Bluto, and Volcan. That being said, as far as visuals go, this game does have a pop-in problem. There were certainly more than a few occasions where pop-in would pull me out of my immersion for a few moments. I remember in particular one time where I was going up a hill that looked bare when a massive enemy camp suddenly popped into view before me. I was probably less than 25 yards away when this happened. And of course, the game does still have frame rate hiccups, but neither of these have a lasting impact on my impressions of the game, so we'll leave it at that. The music and sound design is also great. The subdued piano tracks are very pretty and allow a lot of moments to just breathe and enjoy the silence. The sounds of nature and wildlife are just as important as the actual musical tracks in this game, and fittingly, when in more bustling locations like towns and settlements, the music is a little more dynamic and active without being overpowering, matching the energy of the location. I have almost nothing bad to say about the sound design. There's a minor issue with certain songs coming up a bit too frequently, or songs that come up in multiple locations that are more fitting sometimes than in others. For example, the high altitude song works better in some areas than others. And there are a few recurring songs that I personally like the sound of better in other Zelda games, like the enemy combat theme, but the music is exquisite overall. I don't want to analyze every voice or call out specific performances, but we also have to mention the fact that there is varying degrees of quality in the voice performances. I'm sure in games like this it's hard to get every voice in every language perfect. On screen are some songs that are a highlight in the game for me, in case you're curious. So there's no denying that the art and sound design in this game couple together beautifully to provide one of the most top-notch aspects of this game. I've already mentioned that I think the shrine quests were pretty superb across the board, but how about the standard side quests? Well, there's definitely a lot of fluff with the quests in this game, and the rewards are almost always pretty mediocre, but there are enough memorable and interesting quests that I would say the quests can be called good in the game, even with all the fluff. Some of the most memorable ones being, from the ground up, of course, Hylian Homeowner, Gerudo Secret Club, Leviathan Bones, A Parent's Love, the Royal White Stallion, the Eighth Heroine, the Mystery Polluter, the Stalhorse Quest, Medicinal Molduga. I also really loved the Zora Monuments quest, and loved learning the lore behind the Zora in this game. As for other quests, I've already expressed some of my dismays with the Korok Seed Collectathon, and don't have much to add there. And I do miss heart pieces being able to be found throughout the world, but I realize how poorly this might have worked in practice to include them. Although I do have hope that the Spirit Orb equivalent in Tears of the Kingdom, if it's present, could be something that could be found throughout the world by solving Sky Island puzzles. There's a rumor that this is the case. Now let's talk about the 2 DLC waves. The Trial of the Sword is heart-pounding, and I barely got out of the final trial unscathed. Getting the Master Sword powered up and more durable was super welcome. I haven't had a chance to try out Master Mode yet, but it's something I'll definitely try if I put in another playthrough several years from now. Hero's Path was an amazing tool for me and helped me to track down areas I hadn't explored, but I think it also may have unconsciously made me look at the world more as a checklist to explore in a mathematical way rather than as a place to explore in an organic way. The Korok mask was fun and led to some funny screenshots, but I also got sick of it after a while and it made me feel like I wasn't exploring in a natural way. All the armor sets that call back to characters from previous games were fun, but I didn't use them all that much since it just felt so weird to wear, canonically speaking. I mean, Xant's helmet, for example, that just feels bizarre to wear, even if it's all more for fun than it is for canon. I love the ability to summon my horse with the ancient horse armor. I prefer the horse to the Master Cycle because it feels less out of place in this world, so I was glad for something that made it easier to summon my horse on demand. Don't get me wrong though, the Master Cycle Zero was still undeniably fun. The Champion's Ballad was an excellent DLC that remedied many of my problems with the main game, while also unfortunately further exposing some of those problems. It also solidified Cass as likely being the best overall character. I was thirsty for more story, so it was great to get more memories of the champions in Zelda, and getting upgrades for the champion abilities was really useful, especially for Rivali's Gale. Almost the only bad thing I can say about the Champion's Ballad is that at one point in its runtime it recycles the Blight bosses, but it does add a slightly new flavor by requiring you to use equipment that was equivalent to what the champions had when they faced them. The biggest problem that this DLC solved and exposed was the shrines. With the DLC, there was very little chaff or fluff with the shrines. All 4 of the Great Plateau shrines are super distinct, even if some are still better than others, and in general, the trial sequence on the Great Plateau is very unique. Furthermore, the 12 additional shrines in the 4 main regions are, on average, much more fleshed out than the shrines in the base game, and provide much better escalation of their puzzles and concepts. The DLC also solved and exposed the problems with the dungeons and bosses. The final trial dungeon, while I still think it might be a tad inferior to Va Naboris, could be argued to be the best dungeon in the game. It had a lot more overarching design and moving parts to it that needed to be pieced together to get everything working and get the boss door opened. A really great time. Monk Mazkotia still didn't really require very much use of particular items or runes, but he had so much variety to his fight, and it was fairly challenging, so this was a great time. And oddly, this DLC boss was, without a shadow of a doubt, the best in the game. And I think that's all I've got. I may have missed some details in this overview, but I like to think I've gotten to the heart of this game, so let's conclude. I'll conclude here by answering the question I set out to answer at the beginning. Is Breath of the Wild what the series needed when it came out? Yes and no. There were people getting tired of the old formula, and likely the developers themselves were too, so shaking things up was needed. But I think they shaved away a bit too much of what makes Zelda truly masterful at the same time. There are lots of classic Zelda lovers that dislike or hate Breath of the Wild, which I think shows that there was some overcorrection that occurred. So while it was absolutely a refreshing and necessary change, this new open-air formula has yet to be perfected. I don't think it's any coincidence that people are calling Breath of the Wild a tech demo after seeing the ways in which Tears of the Kingdom is refining and adding to this foundation. I have no doubt Tears of the Kingdom will greatly refine and perfect this formula, But even if it improves Breath of the Wild in almost every respect, Breath of the Wild is a very unique kind of game that I think will still be revisited for years to come, and it is no tech demo. I love the opening to this game. Link stepping out onto the Great Plateau, with that beautiful opening title sequence. Music evocative of a fractured Hyrule. This is a good summary of the game ahead of you. This game isn't about the things that I usually love most in a Zelda game. The story, the dungeons, being a part of the legend of Zelda. It's about creating your own legend. It's about the atmosphere, the quiet and awe-inspiring Hyrule, about breathing in the world around you. And I decided I'm okay with something like that from time to time. When I play Tears of the Kingdom in less than a week, I'm hoping for more of that epic story and those great dungeons and bosses that I crave, and I'm hoping it's not a game that relies so much on that first playthrough joy of discovery that it becomes a bit less special each time. But I'm also just looking forward to revisiting this beautiful Hyrule and exploring it in the same way I explored it the first time I played Breath of the Wild. Really breathing everything in, going where the story and the wind takes me, and not worrying so much about exploring every corner of the world as much as that I let myself become immersed again in exploring Hyrule. If I had to give Breath of the Wild a score, I would likely give it an 8 out of 10, perhaps an 8.5. Before the outcry comes, some perspective. I don't think I have ever given out a 10 to any piece of media in my life. At least not since I actually started to view media critically. And even rating things 9 and above is pretty rare for me. An 8 is a great score in my book, and any game, film, or book with an 8 is a must-have in my collection. Thank you everybody for watching. Please feel free to add to the discussion down below, and like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already, if you find this content enjoyable or insightful. I'll see you all in a little bit, after Tears of the Kingdom releases, starting off with a video of me tackling the opening area to this game. I remember it being fun to watch other people approach the Great Plateau in different ways, so look forward to that. If you want more details on what I plan to cover for Tears of the Kingdom, refer to the community tab on my channel page with a post with more details. Thank you everybody, and have a fantastical day.